Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another reading stream. This is reading chapters 3 and 5 of the Hellbound Heart. I forgot how relatively colorful the language was in chapter 1. So, I don't think there's going to be. I know I've read the book, basically. There should not be necessarily more of that moving forward. Welcome. For those who missed that reading stream from last Tuesday, listen to the replay. You'll know what I'm talking about. You'll know what I'm talking about. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for the super sticker, Mr. Tex. It's a Scream. Very much appreciate that. But welcome, everyone. Glad you're all here. I'll be reading chapters 3 through 5 because these chapters are kind of relatively short. And then subsequent streams, moving forward, at least with this book, I'll be reading chapter 6 and 7 next, then 8 and 9, and then ending with 10 and 11, because there's only about 11 chapters there's only 11 chapters in the Hellbound Heart. They're not that long. So, I've actually thought about cosplaying as Lady Dimitrescu from Resident Evil 8. It would be very ironic because I'm only 5'2", but still. But welcome, everyone. Welcome. Alright, so without further ado, alright, and I guess thank you for the compliment about how my cheeks are better than Melanie Mack's last Toxic Male, but without further ado, Chapter 3 of the Hellbound Heart. Yes, I'm only 5'2", so I'm a shrimp. Anyway. The seasons long for each other, like men and women, in order that they may be cured of their excesses. Spring, if it lingers more than a week beyond its span, starts to hunger for summer, to end the days of perpetual promise. Summer, in turn, soon begins to sweat for something to quench its heat, and the mellowest of autumns will tire of gentility at last, and ache for a quick sharp frost to kill its fruitlessness. Yes, I'm a hobbit. Even winter, the hardest season, the most implacable, dreams as February creeps on of the flame that will presently melt it away. Everything tires with time and starts to seek some opposition to save it from itself. So August gave way to September, and there were few complaints. No worries, Freddy. With work, the house on Lodovico Street began to look more hospitable. There were even visits from neighbors who, after sizing up the couple, spoke freely of how happy they were to have number 55 occupied again. Only one of them made any mention of Frank, referring in passing to the odd fellow who had lived in the house for a few weeks the previous summer. There was a moment of embarrassment when Rory revealed the tenant to have been his brother, but it was soon glossed over by Julia, whose power to charm knew no bounds. Rory had seldom made mention of Frank during the years of his marriage to Julia, though he and his brother were only 18 months apart in age, and had as children been inseparable. This Julia had learned on an occasion of drunken reminiscing, a month or two before the wedding, when Rory had spoken at length about Frank. It had been melancholy talk. The brothers' paths had diverged considerably once they'd passed through adolescence, and Rory regretted it. Regretted still more the pain Frank's wild lifestyle had brought to their parents. It seemed that when Frank appeared, once in a blue moon, from whichever corner of the globe he was presently laying waste, he only brought grief. His tales of adventures in the shallows of criminality, his talk of horrors and petty theft, all appalled their parents. But there had been worse, or so Rory had said. In his wilder moments, Frank had talked of a life lived in delirium, of an appetite for experience that conceded no moral imperative. Was it the tone of Rory's telling, a mixture of revulsion and envy, that had piqued Julia's curiosity? Whatever the reason, she had been quickly seized by an unquenchable curiosity concerning this madman. Then, barely a fortnight before the wedding, the black sheep had appeared in the flesh. Things had gone well for him of late. He was wearing gold rings on his fingers, and his skin was tight and tanned. There was little outward sign of the monster Rory had described. Brother Frank was smooth as a polished stone. She had succumbed to his charm within hours. A strange time ensued. As the days crept toward the date of the wedding, she found herself thinking less and less of her husband-to-be, and more of his brother. They were not wholly dissimilar. A certain lilt in their voices and their easy manner marked them as siblings. But to Rory's qualities, Frank brought something his brother would never have. A beautiful desperation. Perhaps what had happened next had been inevitable, and no matter how hard she had fought her instincts, she would only have postponed the consummation of their feelings for each other. At least, that was how she tried to excuse herself later. When all the self-recrimination was done with, she still treasured the memory of their first and last encounter. Again, welcome everyone. Kirsty had been at the house, hadn't she? Or on some matrimonial business when Frank had arrived. But by that telepathy that comes with desire and fades with it, Julia had known that today was the day. She'd left Kirsty to her list-making or such like and taken Frank upstairs on the pretext of showing him the wedding dress. That was how she remembered it, that he had asked to see the dress, and she'd put the veil on, laughing to think of herself in white, and then he'd been at her shoulder, lifting the veil, and she laughed and laughed, as though to test the strength of his purpose. He had not been cooled by her mirth, however, nor had he wasted time with the niceties of seduction. The smooth exterior gave way to cruder stuff almost immediately. Their coupling had in every regard but the matter of her acquiescence, all the aggression and the joylessness of rape. Memory sweetened events, of course, and in the 4 years and 5 months since that afternoon, she'd replayed the scene often. Now, in remembering it, the bruises were trophies of their passion, her tears proof positive of her feelings for him. This is the mind of Clive Barker. The day following, he disappeared, flitted off to Bangkok or Easter Island, someplace where he had no debts to answer. She'd warned him, couldn't help it. Nor had her mourning gone unnoticed. Though it was never explicitly discussed, she had often wondered if the subsequent deterioration of her relationship with Rory had not started there. With her thinking of Frank as she made love to his brother. Kirsty is supposed to be Kirsten in the movie, basically. So basically, Kirsty in here in the book is a friend of Rory's. They took that character and made it Rory's daughter in the movie. So one of a change that I actually accept, and it makes sense. So, and now, despite the change of domestic interiors and the chance of a fresh start together, it seemed that events conspired to remind her again of Frank. It wasn't just the gossip of the neighbors that brought him to mind. One day, when she was alone in the house and unpacking various personal belongings, she came across several wallets of Rory's photographs. Many were relatively recent, pictures of the two of them together in Athens and Malta, but buried amongst the transparent smiles were some pictures she couldn't remember ever having seen before. Had Rory kept them from her? A family portraits that went back decades. A photograph of his parents on their wedding day. The black and white image eroded over the years to a series of grays. Pictures of christenings, in which proud godparents cradled babies smothered in the family lace. And then, photographs of the brothers together, as toddlers with wide eyes, as surly schoolchildren, snapped at gymnastic displays and in school pageants. Then, as the shyness of acne-ridden adolescence took over, the number of pictures dwindled, until the frogs emerged as princes, the other side of puberty. Seeing Frank in brilliant color clowning for the camera, she felt herself blushing. He had been an exhibitionist youth, predictably enough, always dressed a la mode. Rory, by comparison, looked dowdy. It seemed to her that the brothers' future lives were sketched in these early portraits. Frank the smiling, seductive chameleon, Rory the solid citizen. She had packed the pictures away at last and found, when she stood up, that with the blushes had come tears. Not of regret. She had no use for that. It was fury that made her eyes sting. Somehow, between one breath and the next, she had lost herself. She knew, too, with perfect certainty, when her grip had first faltered, lying on a bed of wedding lace while Frank beset her neck with kisses. Once in a while, she went up to the room with the sealed blinds. So far, they had done little decorating work on the upper floors, preferring to first organize the areas in public gaze. The room had therefore remained untouched. Unentered, indeed, except for these few visits of hers. She wasn't sure why she went up, nor how to account for the odd assortment of feelings that beset her while there, but there was something about the dark interior that gave her comfort. It was a womb of sorts, a dead woman's womb. Sometimes when Rory was at work, she simply took herself up the stairs and sat in the stillness, thinking of nothing, or at least nothing she could put words to. These sojourns made her feel oddly guilty, as she tried to stay away from the room when Rory was around. But it wasn't always possible. Sometimes her feet took her there without instruction to do so. It happened thus that Saturday, the day of the blood. She had been watching Rory at work on the kitchen floor, chiseling several layers of paint from around the hinges, when she seemed to hear the room call. Satisfied that he was thoroughly engrossed in his chores, she went upstairs. It was cooler than usual, and she was glad of it. She put her hand to the wall and then transferred her chilled palm to her forehead. No use, she murmured to herself, picturing the man at work downstairs. She didn't love him, no more than he, beneath his infatuation with her face, loved her. He chiseled in a world of his own. She suffered here, far removed from him. A gust of wind caught the back door below. She heard it slam. Downstairs, the sound made Rory lose his concentration. The chisel jumped its groove and sliced deeply into the thumb of his left hand. He shouted as a gush of color came. The chisel hit the floor. Hell and damnation! She heard, but did nothing. Too late, she surfaced through a stupor of melancholy to realize that he was coming upstairs. Fumbling for the key and an excuse to justify her presence in the room, she stood up, but he was already at the door, crossing the threshold, rushing toward her, his right hand clamped ineptly around his left. Blood was coming in abundance. It welled up between his fingers and dribbled down his arm, dripping from his elbow, adding stain to stain on the bare boards. What have you done? She asked him. What does it look like? He said through gritted teeth. Cut myself. His face and neck had gone the color of window putty. She'd seen him like this before. He had on occasion passed out at the sight of his own blood. Do something, he said queasily. Is it deep? I don't know, he yelled at her. I don't want to look. He was ridiculous, she thought, but this wasn't the time to give vent to the contempt she felt. Instead, she took his bloody hand in hers, and while he looked away, prized the palm from the cut. It was sizable, and still bleeding profusely. Deep blood. Dark blood. I think we'd better take you off to the hospital, she told him. Can you cover it up, he asked, his voice devoid of anger now. Sure, I'll get a clean binding. Come on. No, he said, shaking his ashen face. If I take a step, I think I'll pass out. Stay here, then, she soothed him. You'll be fine. Finding no bandages in the bathroom cabinet the equal of the staunching, she fetched a few clean handkerchiefs from the drawer and went back into the room. He was leaning against the wall now, his skin glossy with sweat. He had patted in the blood he had shed. She could taste the tang of it in the air. Still quietly reassuring him that he wouldn't die of a 2-inch cut, she wound a handkerchief around his hand, bound it on with a second, then escorted him, trembling like a leaf, down the stairs, one by one, like a child, and out to the car. At the hospital, they waited an hour in a queue of the walking wounded before he was finally seen and stitched up. It was difficult for her to know in retrospect what was more comical about the episode, his weakness or the extravagance of his subsequent gratitude. She told him when he became fulsome that she didn't want thanks from him, and it was true. She wanted nothing that he could offer her, except perhaps his absence. Did you clean up the floor in the damp room? She asked him in the following day. They'd called it the damp room since the first Sunday, though there was not a sign of rot from ceiling to skirting board. Rory looked up from his magazine. Gray moons hung beneath his eyes. He hadn't slept well, so he'd said. A cut finger, and he had nightmares of mortality. She, on the other hand, had slept like a babe. What did you say? He asked her. The floor, she said again. There was blood on the floor. You cleaned it up? He shook his head. No, he said simply, and returned to the magazine. Well, I didn't, she said. He offered her an indulgent smile. You're such a perfect Hausfrau, he said. You don't even know when you're doing it. The subject was closed there. He was content, apparently, to believe that she was quietly losing her sanity. She, on the other hand, had the strangest sense that she was about to find it again. Kirsty had hated parties, the smiles to be pasted on over the panic, the glances to be interpreted, and worse, the conversation. She had nothing to say of the least interest to the world, of this she had long been convinced. She'd watched too many eyes glaze over to believe otherwise, seen every device known to man for wheedling oneself out of the company of the dull, from will you excuse me, I believe I see my accountant, to passing out dead drunk at her feet. But Rory had insisted she come to the housewarming. Just a few close friends, he'd promised. She had said yes, knowing all too well what scenario would ensue from refusal. Moping at home in a stew of self-recrimination, cursing her cowardice, and thinking of Rory's sweet face. The gathering wasn't such a torment as it turned out. There were only 9 guests in toto, all of whom she knew vaguely, which made it easier. They didn't expect her to illuminate the room, only to nod and laugh where appropriate. And Rory, his hands still bound up, was at his most winning, full of guileless bonhomie. Okay. She'd even wondered if Neville, one of Rory's work colleagues, wasn't making eyes at her behind his spectacles, a suspicion that was confirmed in the middle of the evening when he maneuvered himself to her side and inquired whether she had any interest in cat breeding. She told him she hadn't, but was always interested in new experiences. He seemed delighted, and on this fragile pretext proceeded to ply her with liquors for the rest of the night. By 11:30, she was a woozy but happy wreck, prompted by the most casual remark to ever more painful fits of giggling. A little after midnight, Julia declared that she was tired and wanted to go to bed. The statement was taken as a general cue for dispersal, but Rory would have none of it. He was up and refilling glasses before anyone had a chance to protest. Kirsty was certain she caught a look of displeasure across Julia's face. Then it passed, and the brow was unsullied once again. She said her good nights, was complimented profusely on her skill with calf's liver, and went to bed. Allergies, sorry. The flawlessly beautiful were flawlessly happy, weren't they? To Kirsty, this has always seemed self-evident. Tonight, however, the alcohol made her wonder if envy hadn't blinded her. Perhaps to be flawless was another kind of sadness. But her spinning head had an inept hold on such ruminations, and the next minute Rory was up and telling a joke about a gorilla and a Jesuit that had her choking on her drink before he'd even got to the votive candles. Upstairs, Julia heard a fresh bout of laughter. She was indeed tired, as she had claimed, but it wasn't the cooking that had exhausted her. It was the effort of suppressing her contempt for the damn fools who were gathered in the lounge below. She had called them friends once, these half-wits, with their poor jokes and their poor pretensions. She had played along with them for several hours. It was enough. Now she needed some cool place, some darkness. As soon as she had opened the door of the damp room, she knew things were not quite as they had been. The light from the shadeless bulb on the landing illuminated the boards where Rory's blood had fallen. Now so clean they might have been scrubbed. Beyond the reach of the light, the room bowed in to darkness. She stepped in and closed the door. The lock clicked into place at her back. The dark was almost perfect, and she was glad of it. Her eyes rested against the night, their surfaces chilled. Then from the far side of the room she heard a sound. It was no louder than the din of a cockroach running behind the skirting boards. After seconds it stopped. She held her breath. It came again. This time there seemed to be some pattern to the sound. A primitive code. They were laughing like loons downstairs. The noise awoke desperation in her. What would she not do to be free of such company? She swallowed and spoke to the darkness. "I hear you," she said, not certain of why the words came or to whom they were addressed. The cockroach scratches ceased for a moment and then began again, more urgently. She stepped away from the door and moved toward the noise. It continued as if summoning her. It was easy to miscalculate in the dark, and she reached the wall before she expected to. Raising her hand, she began to run her palms over the painted plaster. The surface was not uniformly cold. There was a place, she judged it to be halfway between the door and window, where the chill became so intense she had to break contact. The cockroach stopped scratching. There was a moment when she swam, totally disoriented in darkness and silence. And then something moved in front of her. A trick of her mind's eye, she assumed, for there was only imagined light to be had there. But the next spectacle showed her the error of that assumption. The wall was alight, or rather something behind it burned with a cold luminescence that made the solid brick seem insubstantial stuff. More, the wall seemed to be coming apart, segments of it shifting and dislocating like a magician's prop, oiled panels giving on to hidden boxes whose sides in turn collapsed to reveal some further hiding place. She watched fixedly, not daring to even blink for fear she missed some detail of this extraordinary sleight of hand, where all pieces of the world came apart in front of her eyes. Then suddenly, somewhere in this ever more elaborate system of sliding fragments, she saw, or again seemed to see, movement. Only now did she realize that she had been holding her breath since this display began, and was beginning to become lightheaded. She tried to empty her lungs of the stale air and take a draught of fresh, but her body would not obey the simple instruction. Somewhere in her innards, a tick of panic began. The hocus-pocus had stopped now, leaving one part of her admiring quite dispassionately the tinkling music that was coming from the wall, the other part fighting the fear that rose in her throat step by step. Again she tried to take a breath, but it was as if her body had died, and she was staring out of it, unable to now to breathe or blink or swallow. The spectacle of the unfolding wall had now ceased entirely, and she saw something flicker across the brick, ragged enough to be shadow, but too substantial. Sorry. My guess is kind of pulsing. It was human, she saw, or had been, but the body had been ripped apart and sewn together again with most of its pieces either missing or twisted and blackened as if in a furnace. There was an eye gleaming at her, and the ladder of a spine, the vertebrae stripped of muscle, a few unrecognizable fragments of anatomy. That was it. That such a thing might live beggared reason. What little flesh it owned was hopelessly corrupted, yet live it did. Its eye, despite the rot it was rooted in, scanned her every inch, up and down. She felt no fear in its presence. This thing was weaker than her by far. It moved a little in its cell, looking for some modicum of comfort. But there was none to be had. Not for a creature that wore its frayed nerves on its bleeding sleeve. Every place it might lay its body brought pain. This she knew indisputably. She pitied it, and with pity came release. Her body expelled dead air and sucked in living. Her oxygen-starved brain reeled. Even as she did so, it spoke. A hole, opening up in the flayed ball of the monster's head, and issued a single, weightless word. The word was Julia. Kirsty put down her glass and tried to stand up. "Where are you going?" Neville asked her. "Where do you think?" she replied, consciously trying to prevent the words from slurring. "Do you need any help?" Rory inquired. The alcohol made his lids lazy, and his grin lazier still. "I am house-trained," she replied, the repository greeted with laughter all around. She was pleased with herself. Off-the-cuff wit was not her forte. She stumbled to the door. "It's the last room on the right at the end of the landing," Rory informed her. "I know," she said, and stepped out into the hall. She didn't usually enjoy the sensation of drunkenness, but tonight she was reveling in it. She felt loose-limbed and light-hearted. She might well regret this tomorrow, but tomorrow would have to take care of itself. For tonight she was flying. She found her way to the bathroom and relieved her aching bladder, then splashed some water onto her face. That done, she began her return journey. She had taken 3 steps along the landing when she realized that somebody had put out the landing light while she was in the bathroom, and that same somebody was now standing a few yards away from her. She stopped. "Hello," she said. Had the cat breeder followed her upstairs in the hope of proving he wasn't Spade? "Is that you?" she asked, only dimly aware that this was a singular fruitless line of inquiry. There was no reply, and she became a little uneasy. "Come on," she said, attempting a jocular manner that she hoped to master anxiety. "Who is it?" "Me," said Julia. Her voice was odd. Throaty, perhaps tearful. "Are you all right?" Kirsty asked her. She wished she could see Julia's face. "Yes," came the reply. "Why shouldn't I be?" Within the space of those 5 words, the actress in Julia seized control. The voice cleared, the tone lightened. "I'm just tired," she went on. "It sounds like you're having a good time down there. Are we keeping you awake?" "Goodness me, no," the voice gushed. "I was just going to the bathroom." A pause, then, "You go back down. Enjoy yourself." At this cue, Kirsty moved toward her along the landing. At the last possible moment, Julia stepped out of the way, avoiding even the slightest physical contact. "Sleep well," Kirsty said at the top of the stairs, but there was no reply forthcoming from the shadow on the landing. Julia didn't sleep well, not that night, nor any night that followed. What she had seen in the damp room, what she had heard and finally felt was enough to keep easy slumbers at bay forever, or so she began to believe. He was here. Brother Frank was here, in the house, and had been all the time, locked away from the world in which she lived and breathed, but close enough to make the frail, pitiful contact he had. The whys and the wherefores of this she had no clue to. The human detritus in the wall had neither the strength nor the time to articulate his condition. All it had said before the wall began to close on it again, and its wreckage was once more eclipsed by brick and plaster, was "Julia," then simply, "It's Frank," and at the very end the word "blood." Then it was gone completely, and her legs had given way beneath her. She had half fallen, half staggered backward against the opposite wall. By the time she gathered her wits about her once more, there was no mysterious light, no wasted figure cocooned in the brick. Reality's hold was absolute once again. Not quite absolute, perhaps. Frank was still here, in the damp room. Of that she had no doubt. Out of sight he might be, but not out of mind. He was trapped somehow between the sphere she occupied and some other place. A place of bells and troubled darkness. Had he died? Was that it? Perished in the empty room the previous summer and now awaiting exorcism? If so, what had happened to his earthly remains? Only further exchange with Frank himself or the remnants thereof would provide an explanation. Of the means by which she could lend the lost soul strength, she had little doubt. He had given her the solution plainly. "Blood," he had said. The syllable had been spoken not as an accusation, but as an imperative. Rory had bled on the floor of the damp room. The splashes had subsequently disappeared. Somehow Frank's ghost, if that is what it was, had fed upon his brother's spillage, and gained thereby nourishment enough to reach out from his cell and make faltering contact. Was what more might be achieved if the supply were larger? No, it is not the same. She thought of Frank's embraces, of his roughness, his hardness, of the insistence he had brought to bear upon her. What would she not give to have such insistence again? Perhaps it was possible. And if it were, if she could give him the sustenance he needed, would he not be grateful? Would he not be her pet, docile or brutal at her least whim? The thought took sleep away, took sanity and sorrow with it. She had been in love all this time, she realized, and mourning for him. If it took blood to restore him to her, then blood she would supply, and not think twice of the consequences. In the days that followed, she found her smile again. Rory took the change of mood as a sign that she was happy in a new house. Her good humor ignited the same in him. He took to the redecoration with renewed gusto. Soon, he said, he would get to work on the second floor. They would locate the source of the dampness in the large room and turn it into a bedroom fit for his princess. She kissed his cheek when he spoke of this, and she had said that she was in no hurry, that the room they had already was more than adequate. Talk of the bedroom made him stroke her neck and pull her close and whisper infantile obscenities in her ear. She did not refuse him, but went upstairs meekly and let him undress her, as he liked to do, unbuttoning her with paint-stained fingers. She pretended the ceremony aroused her, though this was far from the truth. The only thing that sparked the least appetite in her as she lay on the creaking bed, with his bulk between her legs, was closing her eyes and picturing Frank as he had been. More than once his name rose to her lips each time she bit it back. Finally she opened her eyes to remind herself of the boorish truth. Rory was decorating her face with his kisses. Her cheeks crawled at his touch. She would not be able to endure this too often, she realized. It was too much of an effort to play the acquiescent wife. Her heart would burst. Thus, lying beneath him while September's breath brushed her face from the open window, she began to plot the getting of blood. Chapter 5. Sorry, that was Chapter 4 I just read. Chapter 5. Well, this is actually a good dirty book, JB. I'll just say that. It's actually a good dirty book. Sometimes it seemed that eons came and went while he lingered in the wall. Eons that some clue would later reveal to have been the passing of hours, or even minutes. But now things had changed. He had a chance of escape. His spirit soared at the thought. It was a frail chance. He didn't deceive himself about that. There were several reasons his best efforts might falter. Julia, for one. He remembered her as a trite, preening woman, whose upbringing had curbed her capacity for passion. He had untamed her, of course, once. He remembered the day among the thousands of times he'd performed that act, with some satisfaction. She had resisted no more than was needful for her vanity, then succumbed with such naked fervor he had almost lost control of himself. In other circumstances he might have snatched her from under her would-be husband's nose, but fraternal politics counseled otherwise. In a week or two he would have tired of her, and been left not only with a woman whose body was already an eyesore to him, but also a vengeful brother on his heels. It hadn't been worth the hassle. Besides, there had been new worlds to conquer. He had left the day after to go east, to Hong Kong and Sri Lanka, to wealth and adventure. He had them too, at least for a while, but everything slipped through his fingers sooner or later, and with time he began to wonder whether it was circumstance that denied him a good hold on his earnings, or whether he simply didn't care enough to keep what he had. The train of thought once began with a runaway. Everywhere in the wreckage around him he found evidence to support the same bitter thesis, that he had encountered nothing in his life, no person, no state of mind or body, he wanted sufficiently to suffer even passing discomfort for. A downward spiral began. He spent 3 months in a wash of depression and self-pity that bordered on the suicidal. But even that solution was denied him by his newfound nihilism. If nothing was worth living for, it followed, didn't it? That therefore nothing worth dying for either. He stumbled from one such sterility to the next, until all thoughts were rotted away by whatever opiates his immoralities could earn him. How had he first heard about Lamarchand's box? He couldn't remember. In a bar, maybe? Or a gutter from the lips of a fellow derelict. At the time, it was merely a rumor, the stream of a pleasure dome where those who had exhausted the trivial delights of the human condition might discover a fresh definition of joy. And the route to this paradise? There were several, he was told. charts of the interface between the real and the realer still, made by travelers whose bones had long since gone to dust. One such chart was in the vaults of the Vatican, hidden in code in a theological work, unread since the Reformation. Another, in the form of an origami exercise, was reported to have been in the possession of the Marquis de Sade, who used it while imprisoned in the Bastille to barter with the guard for paper on which to write to the 120 days of Sodom. Yet another was made. I want to find that. I want to read that. Yet another was made by a craftsman, a maker of singing birds, called Le Marchand, in the form of a musical box of such elaborate design a man might toy with it half a lifetime and never get inside. Stories. Stories. Yet since he had come to believe in nothing at all, it was not so difficult to put the tyranny of verifiable truth out of his head, and to pass the time musing drunkenly on such fantasies. It was in Dusseldorf, where he had gone smuggling heroin, that he again encountered the story of Le Marchand's box. His curiosity was piqued once more, but this time he followed the story up until he found its source. The man's name was Kircher, though he probably laid claim to half a dozen others. Yes, the German could confirm the existence of the box, and yes, he could see his way to letting Frank have it. The price? Small favors here and there, nothing exceptional. Frank did the favors, washed his hands, and claimed his payments. There had been instructions from Kircher on how best to break the seal on the Marchand's device, instructions that were part pragmatic, part metaphysical. To solve the puzzle is to travel, he had said, or something like that. The box, it seemed, is not just the map of the road, but the road itself. This new addiction quickly cured him of dope and drink. Perhaps there were other ways to bend the world to suit the shape of his dreams. He came back to the house on Ludovico Street. To the empty house, behind whose walls he was now imprisoned, and prepared himself, just as Kircher had detailed, for the challenging of solving Le Marchand's configuration. He had never in his life been so abstemious, nor so single-minded. In the days before the onslaught on the box, he had led a life that would have shamed a saint, focused all his energies on the ceremonies ahead. He had been arrogant in his dealings with the Order of the Gash. He saw that now. But there were everywhere, in the world and out of it, forces that encouraged such arrogance because they traded on it. That in itself would not have undone him. No, his real error had been the naive belief that his definition of pleasure significantly overlapped with that of the Cenobites. As it was, they had brought incalculable suffering. They had overdosed him on sensuality until his mind teetered on madness. Then they initiated him into experiences that his nerves still convulsed to recall. They had called it pleasure, and perhaps they had meant it. Perhaps not. It was impossible to know with these minds. They were so hopelessly, flawlessly ambiguous. They recognized no principles of reward and punishment by which he could hope to win some respite from their tortures. Nor were they touched by any appeal for mercy. He had tried that over the weeks and months that separated the solving of the box from today. There was no compassion to be had on this side of the schism. There was only the weeping and the laughter. Tears of joy sometimes for an hour without dread, a breath's length even. Laughter coming just as paradoxically in the face of some new horror fashioned by the engineer for the provision of grief. There was a further sophistication to the torture, devised by a mind that understood exquisitely the nature of suffering. The prisoners were allowed to see into the world they had once occupied. Their resting places when they were not enduring pleasure looked out into the very locations where they had once worked the configuration that had brought them here. In Frank's case, onto the upper room of number 55 Ludovico Street. For the best part of the year, it had been an unilluminating view. Nobody had ever stepped into the house. And then, they'd come. Rory and the lovely Julia, and hope had begun again. There were ways to escape, he had heard it whispered, loopholes in the system that might allow a mind supple or cunning enough to egress into the room from which he had come. If a prisoner were able to make such an escape, there was no way that the Hierophants could follow. They had to be summoned across the schism. Without such an invitation, they were left like dogs on the doorstep, scratching and scratching, but unable to get in. Escape, therefore, if it could be achieved, brought with it a decree absolute. Total dissolution of the mistaken marriage with which the prisoner had made. It was a risk worth taking. Indeed, it was no risk at all. What punishment could be meted out worse than the thought of pain without hope of release? He had been lucky. Some prisoners had departed from the world without leaving sufficient sign of themselves from which, given an adequate collision of circumstances, their bodies might be remade. He had, almost his last act, bar the shouting, had been to empty his testicles onto the floor. Dead sperm was the meager keepsake of his essential self, but enough. When dear brother Rory, sweet butterfingered Rory, had let his chisel slip, there was something of Frank to profit from the pain. He had found a fingerhold for himself, and a glimpse of strength with which he might haul himself to safety. Now it was up to Julia. Sometimes, suffering in the wall, he thought she would desert him out of fear. Either that or she'd rationalize a vision she had seen, and decide she'd been dreaming. If so, he was lost. He lacked the energy to repeat the appearance. It's in the mind of Clive Barker. But there were signs that gave him cause for hope. The fact that she'd returned to the room on 2 or 3 occasions, for instance, and simply stood in the gloom, watching the wall. She'd even muttered a few words on the second visit, though he'd caught only scraps. The word "here" was amongst them. And waiting, and soon. Enough to keep him from despair. He had another prop to his optimism. She was lost, wasn't she? He had seen that in her face, when, before the day Rory had chiseled himself, she and his brother had occasion to be in the room together. He had read the looks between the lines, the moments when her guard had slipped, and the sadness and frustration she felt with her parents. Yes, she was lost. Married to a man she felt no love for, and unable to see a way out. Well, here he was. They could save each other the way the poets promised lovers should. He was mystery, he was darkness. He was all she had dreamed of. And if she would only free him, he would service her, oh yes, until her pleasure reached that threshold that, like all thresholds, was a place where the strong grew stronger and the weak perished. Pleasure was pain there, and vice versa, and he knew it well enough to call it home. And thus ends chapter 5. So yes, so we find out... Okay, get my camera to zoom. To fix itself. Come on. There it goes. We find out how exactly Frank was able to absorb the blood. Yeah, these chapters are fast. You know, those were 3 chapters, and they were, like, you know, rather short. But I'm going to only read 2 chapters each stream moving forward, because so that way it's more basically even reading. So 6 and 7 will be next week on Tuesday, followed by 8 and 9 on Thursday, and then ending with chapters 10 and 11 the following Tuesday. So basically, in like 3 reading streams, roughly, I will have the Hellbound Heart finished. So yes, Frank is a trip. So yeah, they changed things in the movie. So like, if you're to watch the movie after listening to the reading stream, you'll see the changes made in the movies, or I should say in the movie, because the first movie is really the adaptation of the book, and then the subsequent sequels are pretty much what if scenarios concocted by the writers. So there it is. But you're welcome, JM. And yes, I can read. And Gigawatts said I should teach Mazza how to read. And I told Gigawatts, if you know Mazza, you know what I'm referring to. But I told Gigawatts that if I can teach Mazza how to read, I deserve a sainthood. Because I will have performed a fucking miracle. That's why I deserve a sainthood, Gravy. You know what? I don't know. They're on par with each other, JM. Mazza has glimmers of hope on occasion, but then I have no idea how his brain works. So, but pretty much. But there it is, chat. So yeah, that ends this reading stream. These reading streams, at least for this book, are going to be relatively short because the chapters themselves are on the short side. Or I guess rather quick reading in comparison to The Lord of the Rings. So that ends this reading stream. Tomorrow, my plan is to be live. I'm not sure exactly when. I'm hoping about 7 p.m., 7:30 p.m. Eastern, roughly. Playing Chronos, the new game, dropping tomorrow. It's a horror survival game. It looks very interesting. It's set in Poland, which kind of piques my interest a little bit. And either Saturday or Sunday, or maybe even both days, my plan is to stream a game called Massacre at the Mirage, an indie survival horror game that's kind of a love letter to campy slasher type horror films from the 80s to 90s era. So I'm looking forward to playing that. I played the demo offline, and I very much got a kick out of it. I think I should be able to stream. I think I should be able to stream Saturday. If not, then it'll be a watch party, pretty much. Yeah, it's well, basically, the locations you go to or in the game are actual locations in Poland. So they basically took actual locations in Poland, and then obviously tweak those locations so they have a feel, like that horror survival feel to them. But those are like genuine locations in the country. So I'll be playing Chronos, and I'll be playing hopefully Massacre at the Mirage. I'm thinking if I can do it Saturday, then Saturday and Sunday, because there will be no D&D Sunday afternoon. So Chronos, if you're asking about that, I don't know. Really, I don't know. It seems like a bit complicated. Massacre at the Mirage is it's pretty much a well, murders are happening, and you gotta survive them, pretty much. But I love it. But I liked it, and if you join my streams, you'll see what I'm talking about in terms of like indie horror and the love letter to 80s. It's like slasher, scary movies, like that genre basically. So, but yes, and then Talk Nerdy. I think Steph did one on her channel last Sunday because I was unavailable. So Talk Nerdy should be on my channel this coming Sunday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I love pierogies. I actually love pierogies. I'm part Polish. I'm part Polish. And if Last Toxic Male is in the chat still, I am Arabic in descent. I am also European Jewish in descent from my Polish ancestry. So the fact that the game is set in Poland, that's and the fact that I have Polish, I'm descended, kind of piques my interest. So there it is. But yeah, I am half Arabic. I have European Jewish ancestry. And I was raised Christian, so go figure. I'm a mutt. I'm a mutt, and I love pierogies. I love pierogies. So, but that on that note, ladies and gentlemen, have a good rest of your day or evening, wherever you are in the world. And I will see you all tomorrow evening for some Chronos, the New Dawn.